Welcome back to Pour la Victoire, the channel where we explore historical sewing techniques. Today's video is a detailed tutorial of how I made a pair of linen stays appropriate for the 1820s, 1830s, and early 1840s. This was a surprisingly simple and satisfying project. I'll be using the terms stays and corset interchangeably throughout this video, although this garment was commonly referred to as stays during that time. Let's start with the research and design for this project. Support garments in the early 1800s were an interesting transition between the conical 18th century stays and shapely later Victorian corsets. Between about 1800 and 1840, stays were soft, simple garments designed to improve posture and lift the bust. The primary method of stiffening these stays was a wooden busk in the center front of the stays. Quilting and cording provided additional support and stiffness to the fabric. Stays had a long silhouette and pushed the bust up and out. These stays were almost always shaped with triangular gores at the bust and hip. Linen and cotton were common fabrics for early 19th century stays. I had this natural colored, firmly woven linen in my stash that seemed perfect for this project. I needed something to bind the edges of the stays, so I chose this vintage blue Petersham ribbon from my stash. While this style of stays was usually all white or beige, I found this example from the Metropolitan Museum of Art that had contrast blue stitching. This 1820s linen corset also had contrast blue stitching, so I decided to use blue thread for my eyelets and embroidery to match the blue binding ribbon. To construct the stays, I chose to use Past Patterns 001. This is an older pattern published in 1986, but it's full of historical information and detail. It even shows you how to carve your own wooden busk. This pattern includes two styles of stays, both copied from original garments. I also looked at the Workwoman's Guide, published in 1840, which had an entire section on making stays. I'll link this book in the description below. The stays described in the Workwoman's Guide are very similar to the original stays reproduced in the Past Patterns draft. Like the stays described in the Workwoman's Guide, both View A and View B are made up of a front piece, two back pieces, bust gores, and hip gores. I started with a mock-up of View A, which is based on stays a young woman wore to her wedding in 1840. View A felt too tight and long. The narrow triangular bust gores flattened my bust and pushed it towards my armpits. I think the narrow shape of the bust gores and the overall corset makes sense though, because the original garment was worn by a young woman. The View A bust gore is allegedly sized for a B-cup bust, but my bust is 32 inches and it was too small for me. Even though this pattern goes up to a 41-inch bust, the bust gore draft of View A is the same for all sizes. Next, I tried a mock-up of View B, which had more curve in the gores. View B fit much better, but I still wanted to tinker with the gore shape. Several original 19th century corsets appear to have gores with a distinct straight and curved side, like this 1820s example in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. The curved side of the gore is oriented towards the center of the bust, which I think helps to add shape there. I have this 1860s corset pattern, Simplicity 7215, that includes this style of bust gore shape, one straight edge and one curved edge. So I use these gores on one side of my View B mock-up. This style of gore fits so much better. I feel lifted and supported, and like I'm getting the apples on a platter look instead of squished dough. The View B straps were too long and wide, and even after adjusting them to be shorter and narrower, I decided to go with the View A straps. The bias curve of the View A straps makes the straps hug my shoulder and keeps them snugly in place. I did mark a dart on the back of the straps to make them fit better. At this point, I thought I'd want the straps to tie on in the front, so I shortened the strap to accommodate it. I changed the strap attachment method later though, stay tuned. I marked where the top edges of the bust gores should be. I'm short-waisted and this mock-up has lots of horizontal wrinkles at my waist, which indicates that it's too long in the waist for me. I'll shorten the waist of the pattern just above the hip gores. And that's my completed mock-up. Past Patterns 001 View B with bust gores from Simplicity 7215, and with modified straps from Past Patterns View A. The first step in making these stays is to cut out the fabric. For this pattern, I cut out 2 back pieces, 4 bust gores, 4 hip gores, 2 straps, and 2 front pieces. 1 front piece will become the lining. To cut the slits for the gores, I first make a small snip on the edge of the fabric, cutting through the pattern's marking for the slit. I like to trace my patterns onto tissue paper so I don't have to worry about little cuts and adjustments like this damaging the original pattern. With the pattern piece still pinned to the linen fabric, I fold up the paper at the top of the gore slit. I use pins to mark the top of the slit and then slice through my fabric to create the slit. I could have used chalk or pencil to mark the slit, but this linen fabric is firmly woven, so I felt comfortable somewhat eyeballing it. The pattern recommends stay stitching around the slit before cutting it, but I didn't find this necessary. During the process of making several mock-ups for this project, I had the opportunity to test different methods of inserting gores, and I'm excited to share with you the easiest technique for sewing a gore into a slit. First, draw your seam allowance onto the right side of your gores. I'm using a dull pencil for this, and because this drawn line will be covered later by fabric, I'm not concerned about making a permanent marking. Just choose a marking tool that won't bleed onto your fabric. These hip gores have a 1/2 inch seam allowance. On the wrong side of your fabric, press down the seam allowances of the slit, starting at 1/2 inch on the raw edge side and tapering to nearly nothing at the end of the slit. Repeat this process of pressing down the seam allowances on the other edge of the slit. Flip your fabric so the right side is facing up and slide your gore under the slit. Position the bottom of the slit over where the seam allowances cross at the bottom of the gore. Then line up the folded edge of the slit with the marked seam allowance on the gore. Pin the 2 pieces together. And then press again with a hot iron. I'll be sewing this on my sewing machine, but you could just as easily hand sew this. To mimic the look of hand stitching, I'm using this heavyweight thread in my top bobbin and setting my machine to a shorter stitch length. I also reduced the speed of my sewing machine so that I could have more control. I'm trying to sew as close as possible to the folded edge of the slit. I pivot the needle at the bottom of the slit and then make 1 or 2 small stitches across the bottom before pivoting the needle again and sewing up the other side of the slit. The method of sewing the gores recommended by the pattern is to sew the gores from the wrong side of the fabric, eyeballing the tapered seam allowance of the slit. With that method, you can't see how the gore is lining up with the slit, and I found that method more prone to puckering at the top of the slit or not catching the slit fabric in the seam. I highly recommend top stitching the gore from the right side of the fabric, with the seam allowances pressed in. It's so much faster and easier. Then I carefully trimmed the seam allowances of the gores. I also trimmed the extra length from the gores. Now that the bust gores are sewn in, you can see the effect they have on the shape of the corset. Without any boning or structure, the bust area is curvy thanks to the curved edges of the bust gores. It's okay if there are some loose threads at the bottom of the gores, because this area will be reinforced with embroidery stitches later. These stays are made of 2 layers of fabric, in between which the cording and boning are encased. The lining of the stays is prepared in the same way as the outer layer. Press in the seam allowances of the slits, starting at 1/2 inch and tapering to almost nothing. The raw edges of the lining layer are lined up with the raw edges of the outer layer, and then the folded edges of the slit seam allowance are lined up with the stitching of the gores. The lining is then carefully sewn by hand to the gores using a whip stitch. At the base of the gore, I made my stitches closer together to reinforce this delicate area. I'm using regular white cotton sewing thread here. Your stitching should disappear into your fabric, but if your stitches are visible from the right side of the fabric, that's okay, because embroidery will cover this angle later. Now we're ready to sew the front piece of the corset to the back pieces. The Workwoman's Guide says, in sewing the seams, take great care to turn in the work properly, so as to have all the rough edges within the stay. The mode of sewing these 4 thicknesses so as to make them lie flatly when opened is rather peculiar. Take up with your needle 3 of the thicknesses, leaving the 4th unsewed. Continue alternately taking up one outside and omitting the other, letting the stitches lie close together. When completed, open the seam and flatten it with finger and thumb. This technique sounds familiar. Let's hop back in time to the 1700s. And there it is, the same technique described in the American Duchess Guide to 18th Century Dressmaking. Called the English stitch, it's an efficient and clean way to join your outer and lining fabrics while sewing a seam. So let's try it. First, let's fold and press the 1/2-inch seam allowance of the outer and lining layers to the inside. I did this on the front piece of the corset and the 2 back pieces. To keep the turned-in seam allowance in place while I sewed the seam, I basted along this folded edge. Now my corset pieces are prepped and ready to be seamed together. With the right sides together, I pinned the front piece to one of the back pieces. I'll be sewing the side seams with the thick beige thread I used earlier for top stitching the gores. I pull my needle through 3 of the 4 layers, leaving the layer closest to the last stitch unsewn. I repeat this from the other side, going through 3 of the 4 layers, skipping 1 outer layer of fabric. The English stitch technique is surprisingly fast and efficient. I'm amazed that this technique, which was used to quickly create gowns in the 18th century, was used nearly 100 years later to quickly make corsets. I think it's important to recognize, though, that the Workwoman's Guide had a particular emphasis on efficient sewing techniques, as the book was written with the intention of helping people make clothes for charity. I'm not sure if this seaming technique was commonly used in the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s outside of this specific example. Even though I sewed this seam by hand, the process was super quick, and the finished seam is delightfully strong and sturdy. When I flatten the seam with my fingers, all the layers of fabric lay flat. I think the flatness of the seam will be very comfortable in a tight-fitting garment like this. Now that the body of the corset has been assembled, we can sew the channels for the busk, cording, and boning. I got this tapered wooden busk from corsetmaking.com. I'll leave a link to it down below. I marked the busk pocket at the center front of my stays with pins and chalk. The busk needs to be able to slide in and out of the pocket so that the corset is easier to wash and put on. Because my busk is tapered, I made the busk pocket opening at the bottom of the stays, but if you were working with an evenly shaped busk, you could place the opening at the top of the stays. A ribbon laced through eyelets at the bottom of the pocket will keep the busk from sliding out. I marked the placement of the eyelets 1/2 inch from the bottom of the stays and 1 inch apart from each other. There will be 2 eyelets in the lining and 2 corresponding eyelets in the outer fabric. Fun fact, the Workwoman's Guide spells eyelets with O-Y. Isn't it interesting how language changes over time? To make the pocket opening, I fold up 1/4 inch of the lining. Then I snip in 1/4 inch along my marked busk pocket line. This allows the pocket to be accessible after the bottom edge of the corset is bound. I used an awl to spread apart the fibers of the fabric. This creates a strong, durable eyelet hole and is better than punching out a hole. With 3 strands of my blue embroidery thread, I worked a buttonhole stitch around the eyelet hole. To sew a buttonhole stitch, bring the needle up through your fabric and wrap the thread around the needle once. Then pull the needle through the fabric. I find that wiggling the thread back and forth after this step helps to lock in the stitches. You can also finish off eyelets with whip stitches tightly placed together. In hindsight, I realized that I should have used just 2 strands of embroidery thread for the eyelets. With 3 strands of thread, the eyelets are a bit chunky. On my sewing machine, I sewed 2 rows of stitches along my previous Busk pocket markings. I kept the thicker thread in the top bobbin for a hand-sewn look. With a matching blue silk ribbon threaded through the eyelets, I'm now able to secure the busk in place. Many original stays had a line of cording alongside the busk, so I sewed another line of stitches next to the busk pocket to make a channel for the cording. At this point, I ignored the pattern's suggested cording layout and came up with my own, simpler design. After all, the Workwoman's Guide says to add cording according to your fancy. I started with some horizontal cording under the bust, 2 sections with 3 rows each. Because my stays were basically made of rectangles, it was very easy to just measure out the lines for my channels directly onto my fabric. Many extant corsets also had a seam or cording channel placed diagonally across the front, so I marked diagonal lines from the back underarm to front hip area for cording channels. All of the cording channels were sewn by machine. I used chalk as a guideline for the placement of the channels, and then lined up the presser foot of my sewing machine to stitch the rows. This technique gave me mostly even rows of stitching and felt more precise than making dozens of chalk lines. Instead of backstitching at the ends of the channels, I carefully pulled the thread tails to the lining side of the corset, and then sewed a few backstitches to secure the threads. Threading and rethreading the needle for this was the most boring and time-consuming part of the whole process. But it was worth it, and I think securing the threads by hand helped the stays look pretty and neat. Before we add cording to these channels, let's add some embroidered details. The Workwoman's Guide recommends sewing a buttonhole stitch around the top of the gore. This will reinforce that area and help prevent the fabric from fraying. I learned my lesson on the Busk pocket eyelets and used just 2 strands of embroidery floss this time. I start by securing my thread on the lining side of the stays with a few back stitches. Then I bring my needle through the gore to the right side of the stays. I point my needle down through the fabric, away from the gore. I don't pull the needle all the way through, making sure to leave a little loop of thread. Then I bring my needle back up through the gore and through the loop of the thread. As with the eyelets, I wiggle and pull the thread a little bit to lock in the stitches. Then I bring the needle down into the stays again, leaving a thread loop, bringing the needle up through the loop, twisting, and repeating this all around the bottom of the gore. As I made these stays, I was reminded of a moment many years ago when I watched my late grandmother make a supportive cotton undergarment. Kind of like a bustier, but much simpler. In a mix of horror and amazement, I watched as she wrapped the piece of fabric around her body instead of carefully measuring and drafting, as she tore the cotton instead of cutting it with sharp scissors, as she eyeballed the placement of darts and straps. To my surprise, the project was finished in an afternoon and the finished garment fit her well. I couldn't understand how someone could have the confidence and comfort to just do it. I wonder if a woman in the 1830s would have approached these stays in the same way. Cut some rectangles, seam them together, eyeball the details, and trust that it'll all work out in the end. My grandmother passed away last summer, and I wish I could have had a chance to show her how far my sewing has come. Anyway, thanks for sticking around this long and listening. I finished off the embroidery with some back stitches in the lining. I wanted to add some decorative embroidery in between the horizontal cording channels. I started by cutting out a paper template that fit that space, and then sketching out my design. I went for a wave with leaves, as these motifs seem to be common in corsets of this time. And yes, that is a plate of cheese on my work surface. It's important to eat snacks and drink water even when you're hyper-focused on a project. To transfer the embroidery template to my fabric, I wanted to try a technique called prick and pounce. I could swear I read about this technique in a 19th century sewing book, but I've gone through all of my sewing and embroidery books and can't find it. Let me know in the comments below if you've heard of the prick and pounce technique. To start, I pricked the template with a pin. Next comes the pounce, in which we dust on cinnamon, which is fine enough to settle through the pricked holes in the template. At first, I tried using a scrap of fabric to hold the cinnamon, but I think my fabric was too tightly woven or clingy because I couldn't get the cinnamon out onto the template. I'm pretty sure that when I read about this technique, the suggested method was to use an old sock for the pouncing, but this just wasn't working for me. Then I tried just sprinkling on the cinnamon and brushing it very gently with my fingers across the holes in the template. This approach worked. Just enough cinnamon ended up on the fabric that I could see the design. I removed the paper template and traced over the cinnamon with pencil. I was pleased to learn that the cinnamon brushes off easily without staining the fabric. I embroidered the design with a backstitch using 2 strands of blue embroidery floss. I actually learned how to embroider before I learned how to sew, but believe it or not, this was my first time using a backstitch in an embroidery project. I remember feeling so intimidated by this technique, and I couldn't get my stitches even when I tried. I think all my historical hand sewing has given me lots of unexpected embroidering practice. With the embroidery complete, I can now add cording to the corset. I'm using white cotton yarn for the cording, the same stuff I used to create piping. With a long, blunt upholstery needle, I thread the cording through the narrow channels. This takes some wiggling. At the end of the channel, I poke the needle through the lining, pulling the cord through. By giving the fabric a few gentle tugs, I help the cord settle into the channel. Then I just snip off the excess cord. I repeat this process on all the cording channels, poking the needle through the lining layer to thread the cord through the channel. Any holes made by the blunt needle disappeared after wiggling and stretching the fabric a bit. I think my choice of fabric made this process easier too, as the linen was somewhat flexible and forgiving. It didn't resist the blunt needle or cord. Per the recommendation of the Workwoman's Guide, I sewed channels for boning on either side of where the back lacing eyelets would be. The book says to add 2 bones at the extreme ends to prevent the holes from bursting beyond the edge, and a second bone down each back on the other side of the lace holes. I'm using plastic whalebone for my boning, and I file down the cut ends of the boning before inserting it into the channels so that it won't snag on my fabric. I also added 2 channels of cording alongside the boning for extra reinforcement. And here are the stays with all of their boning, cording, and embroidery. I added a few extra diagonal cording channels alongside the bust for better support. I'm absolutely thrilled with how the cording turned out. The layout feels simple and sufficient. Before I finished off the top and bottom of the stays with binding, I trimmed some of the extra threads and frayed edges. The armhole curves looked suspiciously narrow on this pattern, so I widened the tops of the curves a little bit. I like to use Petersham ribbon to bind stays. The wavy edge of the ribbon makes it wonderfully flexible around curves. I ironed the ribbon in half along its length and then wrapped the ribbon around the top edge of the stays, leaving a little bit of extra ribbon at the back to be folded under later. At the corners of the underarm curve, I pinch and fold the ribbon at a right angle, similar to how you would wrap binding around the edge of a quilt or blanket. One of the great things about Petersham ribbon is that it can be ironed into a curved shape, like I'm doing here. This will help the ribbon hug the tight curve of the underarm without rippling. From the right side of the stays, I sew the ribbon on with back stitches. I'm using regular sewing thread in a matching blue color that I happen to have in my stash. I'm not trying to sew through all the layers of fabric in this step, as the binding on the lining side of the stays will be secured later. When I get to the corner, I sew a few whip stitches along the fold of the ribbon binding. Then I bring my needle under the ribbon, back through the stays, and continue backstitching the ribbon to the front of the stays. At the center back edges, I fold in the ribbon and then whip stitch along the fold. Then I bring the needle under the ribbon to the lining side, where I continue to sew the ribbon on, this time using whip stitches. I find this is the easiest way to bind stays, and it works especially well for binding the tabs of 18th century stays. You'll notice that I don't use a lot of pins when I stitch on binding. I feel like I get better control by holding down the binding as I sew it, and this also reduces the risk of being scratched or stabbed by pins. I repeat this process for the binding along the bottom edge of the corset. When I get to the busk pocket opening, I make sure to only whip stitch the binding to the outer layer of the fabric, as the lining layer has to be free of binding in order to function as the pocket opening. The stays are laced up the back in a spiral configuration, which will allow me to easily pull on the laces to tighten them. For spiral lacing, the eyelets are offset at the top and bottom, so on one side of the stays I made the second eyelet half an inch away from the first. The remaining eyelets are 1 inch apart from each other. The last 2 eyelets on this side of the stays are also placed half an inch away from each other to complete the spiral configuration. I worked a buttonhole stitch around the eyelets using 2 strands of embroidery floss. The last thing to do is attach the straps. I was originally going to make the straps tie on in front, but then I realized that this corner under the arm would fold over without the strap fully attached to it. This is when I realized why the pattern has the underarm area shaped like this. I cut out a new set of straps that were slightly longer with a squared off instead of curved front edge. In other words, the original straps in this pattern. The back edges of the straps were hemmed by machine. The remaining 3 edges of each strap were bound in the same blue Petersham ribbon, using the exact same method as the rest of the stays. Iron the ribbon in half lengthwise, backstitch on the front of the fabric, and whip stitch on the back of the fabric. The straps are only 1 layer of linen to take advantage of the slight bias cut. I started by attaching the straps to the back of the stays, lining up the curved outer edge of the strap with the back underarm corner. Using matching blue thread, I sewed the straps on by hand, sewing through the blue ribbon binding at the top of the stays. I realized that I could have sewn the straps onto the back of the corset before adding the binding along the top edge, but I actually preferred the flexibility of finishing off the corset and straps separately. It helped me tweak the fit of the straps, and I can readjust the straps in the future without having to remove the binding. Finally, I tried on the stays to see where the front of the strap should be sewn on. My straps had about an extra inch of length that I tucked inside the stays. I stitched on the front of the straps by sewing through the ribbon binding of the stays. And there we have it, a historically accurate pair of stays appropriate for the 1820s, 1830s, and early 1840s. To put on the stays by myself, I remove the busk and put them on backwards. Then, using a blunt needle, I lace up the stays with narrow twill tape. Then I move the stays around my body, adjust my chemise, put my arms through the straps, and tighten the laces. Finally, the busk gets tied into its pocket. This project was surprisingly easy, and despite all the hand-sewn details, I finished these stays in about 3 weeks. I would recommend past patterns 001 with the caveat that the bust sizing is off for anyone above an A cup. The layout of instructions in the pattern was overwhelming, and I found myself writing out a numbered list of instructions instead of following the pattern's instructions. I'm happy with how I deviated from the pattern, especially with my cording layout and bust gores. The corset is comfy to wear, and I have a great range of motion. It also feels comfy and supportive without the busk. In the future, I might lower the top edge of the bust gores, or add some supportive padding because this area ended up being a bit big on me. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like down below, and if you'd like to see more Victorian sewing content, please subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching!